Fairy tales are usually easily digestible fables encompassing childhood innocence and fantastical worlds where magic reigns supreme, good triumphs over evil, and happiness is forever after. However, if you go back to the original stories that inspired our most treasured fairy tales, you'd probably be shocked at what you found. The stories we tell children have changed dramatically over the last 100 years. Many of the most famous and well-loved fairy tales that appeared during the 20th century are often modern, sanitized versions of older stories that would now be considered dangerously risque. Women are presented as helpless beauties who can do little but wait until their knight in shining armor arrives, while class distinctions, overt sexism, racism, and anti-Semitism are often not very hard to find. Many of these films now come with a warning aimed to protect the young. Agree with these trigger warnings or not, the content we're giving our children today is becoming safer, more diluted, less controversial, and considerably more acceptable than ever in the past. It's easy to look at this as modern trends, but the truth is, those treasured fairy tales many of us grew up on were still worlds away from the original stories that inspired them. In fact, those stories were not even initially intended for children, but were part of an oral tradition that served to entertain adults and impart harsh moral lessons. The original versions of Sleeping Beauty, Cinderella, Snow White, and the Seven Dwarfs and Rapunzel were at times horrific and included graphic scenes of violence, rape, child abuse, and incest that would leave modern viewers desperately scrambling to cover their children's eyes. They were indeed fairy tales, but not as you remember them. One of the earliest versions of Sleeping Beauty, published by Giambattista Basile as Sun, Moon and Talia, presents a narrative filled with truly disturbing overtones that gradually softened over time with several subsequent versions. Part of Basile's collection, Pantaleon, Sun, Moon and Talia predates the more familiar versions of the Sleeping Beauty story by Charles Perrault and the Brothers Grimm. His rendition, written in the early 17th century, reflects the realities of its time, where tales were not merely for entertainment, but also served as cautionary tales with complex, often grim lessons about the darker sides of human nature and society. The themes of sexual assault, infidelity, and revenge in Basile's narrative highlight the adult themes that were common in folktales before they were adapted and diluted for a younger audience. Modern retellings of the Sleeping Beauty story, including those by Perrault, the Brothers Grimm, and especially the Disney adaptation, focus on themes of love, redemption, and magical intervention, all set within a moral and simple narrative framework. The protagonist is passive but pure. Her revival is an act of true love, and her ultimate fate is happily ever after. These versions have been almost entirely cleansed of the more violent and controversial elements in order to create a story that's suitable for children. Sun, Moon and Talia. It begins in a traditional fairy tale manner, with a great lord learning from wise men and astrologers that his beloved daughter Talia will be put in great danger by a splinter of flax. Despite the lord's efforts to prevent this prophecy by banning flax from his house, Talia eventually encounters the beast, gets the splinter under her fingernail, and falls into a death-like sleep. Believing her to be dead, her father leaves her in one of his estates. Sometime later, a king, hunting in the woods, stumbles upon the estate and finds Talia. Unable to wake her, he is overtaken by her beauty and rapes her while she is still unconscious. Talia later gives birth to Sun and Moon twins while still asleep. She awakens only because one of the babies, in an attempt to suckle, draws out the flax splinter from her finger. Unlike the passive and romantic awakening seen in versions like Disney's, Talia's return to consciousness in Basile's story is accidental and has nothing to do with love or destiny. When the king's wife, the queen, learns of his infidelity and the existence of his illegitimate children, her vengeance is directed not only at Talia, who she views as a rival, but also at the innocent children. She orders the cook to kill the twins and serve them as a meal to the unknowing king. Though the cook substitutes the children with other meat and hides them, the queen's plot adds a bizarrely cannibalistic, macabre layer to the tale that is disturbingly graphic compared to the relatively mild punishments meted out in sanitized versions. The story concludes with the king discovering the queen's wickedness and condemning her to death by burning. He marries Talia, but the narrative provides little closure regarding her feelings or perspective, focusing instead on the king's actions and decisions. The most shocking difference between Basile's version and later tales is what happens when the main character is asleep. In the modern versions, the princess is awakened by a kiss, an act symbolizing romantic love and mutual consent. In contrast, Basile's story involves a violent act that today would be recognized as nothing less than sexual assault. Who didn't fall in love with the 1950 film Cinderella? It's a charming, uplifting tale of a downtrodden maiden destined for more in life. It's a simple story. A gentle and beautiful girl is maltreated by her evil stepmother and stepsisters, attends the royal ball with the help of a fairy godmother, and wins the princess' heart, ultimately escaping a life of servitude. Simple. Easy, not too complicated. But that's just what we have today. There could be anywhere between 350 and 1,500 versions of Cinderella, depending on how far you want to stretch the interpretation, and most of them are considerably darker. It's a well-trodden tale, with the first believed version thought to originate from ancient Egypt. Our friend Giambattista Basile wrote Cenerentola in 1634, but it's very different from what we know as Cinderella. In it, the young heroine, Zozola, actually decapitates her own evil stepmother, but soon after realizes that she's been tricked by her governess, who becomes the new queen and has Zozola ostracized. In Perrault's tale, Cinderella, or the Little Glass Slipper, dark and complex subtexts relate to 17th century social hierarchies and gender roles. At the outset, Cinderella is depicted not just as an orphaned girl, but as one betrayed by those closest to her. Her father, though still alive, turns a blind eye to the abuse she suffers under her stepmother. This neglect and emotional abandonment by her father contrasts sharply with the modern interpretations, where the father is usually absent or dead, removing any complicity. It's much harder to accept when you know a father is in the picture, but just doesn't care. Perrault's choice reflects a critique of aristocratic fathers who, obsessed with their own social standing, often disregarded their familial duties under the pressures of social appearances. But good luck including a father in a modern fairy tale who turns a blind eye to his new wife beating his child. In Perrault's tale, the stepmother and stepsisters are not simply cruel, but are symbolic of the cutthroat competition for wealth and status among the aristocracy. Their treatment of Cinderella reflects the ruthlessness required to maintain or improve one's social standing. The Brothers Grimm spun Cinderella with their own particular style of dark magic in the mid-19th century that saw the stepsisters cut off their own toes and heels in an attempt to fit into the hallowed glass slipper. Little Red Riding Hood is a tale of caution that has evolved considerably through the ages. In Charles Perrault's version, which predates the Brothers Grimm's more familiar adaptation, there is no happy ending where the woodsman comes to save Little Red Riding Hood and her grandmother. Instead, the story ends with the wolf devouring the younger protagonist after she naively disobeys her mother's warning about talking to strangers. The Brothers Grimm version, which they titled Little Red Cap in their collection of folktales first published in the early 19th century, while a little more upbeat than the tragedy of Perrault, is still notably darker and more menacing than the often sanitized contemporary version of the tale. It follows the basic premise familiar to many. A young girl is sent by her mother to deliver food to her sick grandmother and is instructed not to stray far from the path in the woods. However, the Grimm's narrative has a dark edge that is impossible to miss. In the Grimm's tale, the wolf is not just a cunning animal. He symbolizes the dangers that lurk outside the safe confines of family and community. When Little Redcap meets the wolf, she naively tells him where she is going, showing her innocence and the wolf's predatory nature. The wolf's intentions are sinister from the outset, planning not just to eat her, but to deceive her and lead her further into danger. Unlike more straightforward renditions of this tale, the Brothers Grimm elaborate on the wolf's deceit. He cunningly suggests that Little Redcap pick some flowers for her grandmother, distracting her and giving him time to reach the house first. When the wolf reaches the grandmother's house, he devours her. Then, in a gruesome twist, he dresses in her clothes to trick Little Red Cap. When Little Red Cap arrives, she too is deceived and becomes dinner. The tale then takes another dark turn before the resolution. A huntsman, hearing the wolf's loud snores, enters the grandmother's house and finds the wolf asleep. In a graphic and vivid scene, the huntsman cuts open the wolf's stomach, from which Little Red Cap and her grandmother emerge alive. The act of cutting them free from the wolf's belly is said to symbolize a rebirth and a return to safety from the depths of danger and death. The Brothers Grimm did not end their tale following the rescue. Instead, they added another layer, where Little Red Cap and her grandmother devise a plan to deal with the wolf if it ever returns. They fill a trough outside with sausages and water, which the wolf consumes so greedily upon his return that he dies. Modern interpretations of Little Red Riding Hood often focus on the lighter aspects of the story. They emphasize the moral of not talking to strangers and typically avoid the more violent or disturbing elements, such as the grandmother and Little Red Cap's consumption or the graphic nature of the rescue. Contemporary versions also frequently make the ending less gruesome, with the wolf often being chased away rather than killed. The darkness in the Grimm's version of Little Red Riding Hood reflects broader themes prevalent in 19th century German society. Again, it was a cautionary tale meant to teach young children, particularly girls, about the dangers of the wider world and the consequences of failing to adhere to parental guidance. The graphic scenes of violence and the ultimate moral lessons were aligned with the Grimm's objectives of instilling strong values and awareness of societal dangers in their young readers. These strong values were actually later hijacked by the Nazi Party, which produced a version of Little Red Riding Hood where the young girl represented the German people and the big bad wolf eager to steal and devour, of course, represented the Jews. The Tale of Snow White by the Brothers Grimm contains elements far darker than the Disney adaptation. In the Grimm's version, the evil queen is Snow White's biological mother, not her stepmother, which adds a layer of creepy psychological complexity and betrayal. Moreover, in her quest to kill Snow White, the queen first orders a huntsman to take her into the forest and bring back her lungs and liver as proof of her death. After several failed assassination attempts and Snow White's eventual revival by the prince, the queen is forced to dance in red-hot iron shoes at their wedding until she drops dead. This gruesome punishment, which the Grimms explicitly describe, is a moral lesson on the dark consequences of envy and wickedness. Now, that's all a little bit different from what you might remember from your childhood, right? Unlike modern versions where the queen's jealousy might be depicted as superficial or comical, the Grimm's queen is deeply sinister. Her envy drives her to extreme actions, including multiple murder attempts on Snow White. The first attempt is with a tight-laced dress that nearly chokes Snow White to death. When that fails, the queen tries to poison her comb before finally resorting to the iconic poisoned apple that we know from the modern version. The Queen's malevolence is not just a character flaw, but a portrayal of deep-seated wickedness and moral corruption, a stark representation of human nature's darker sides that we rarely see in modern tales. Snow White's apparent death and placement in a glass coffin adds a really macabre element to the story. In the original tale, she is revived not by a kiss as in the Disney adaptation, but by accident. The prince's servants stumble while carrying the coffin, dislodging the piece of poisoned apple from Snow White's throat. This method of revival strips away the romantic elements typically associated with her awakening and instead introduces a sense of randomness and fragility to life and death in the tale. Modern renditions of Snow White, especially those aimed at children, focus on the heroine's virtues and the romance between Snow White and the prince. They often downplay the queen's evil deeds and omit the more violent aspects of the tale, such as the nature of the queen's death. The dark themes of jealousy, revenge, mortality, and outright murder are softened or completely omitted to present a more digestible narrative for contemporary audiences. Sitting down with a fairy tale has been a part of almost every childhood, yet its messages and presentation have changed dramatically. Modern interpretations usually carry a subtle darkness that can be more unsettling than the overtly grim themes of their original counterparts. While traditional fairy tales, such as those collected by the Brothers Grimm or penned by Giambattista Basile and Charles Perrault, were unflinching in their depiction of violence, hardship, and moral lessons. Contemporary retellings frequently mask these harsh realities with polished narratives and happy endings. The veneer of safety and simplicity is all well and good, but does it obscure the underlying anxieties and complex human emotions that the stories initially aim to address? We seem to be on a crusade to make children's stories as nice and as easily digestible as possible, but it's rarely reflected in the real world. Modern stories increasingly focus on the individual. They preach about overcoming adversity and dismantling society's evils, about being whoever you want to be in life and not allowing others to stand in your way. Gender roles are dissolved. The world is portrayed as a damaged but inherently good place, and that's all great. But these are the easy stories to tell. Traditional fairy tales were not designed to be controversial. They were written to highlight certain darker aspects of humanity that still very much present today. They were designed to teach adults and children about the dangers of the world. Increasingly, we want stories for our children that entertain and distract, usually with a nicely packaged moral framework embedded. We like to avoid topics that we don't feel comfortable with, and choose instead to focus on safer themes like self-improvement and well-being, both of which are vital, but only make up a small part of the vast human experience that is life.